to the Ask Historians podcast.
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast. I am your host for today, Johannes Breit, also known on the forum as Call Me Space Invader. Joining me is Dr. Daniel Lee, Professor of History at Queen Mary University in London. He is the author of the book we will cover today, the recently released The SS Officers Armchair. Welcome, Daniel.
Thank you, Johannes. So nice to be here.
So I'm going to start off with asking you to introduce yourself to our listeners and to the audience for the podcast.
Great. So hello, everybody listening out there. So yeah, as Johannes said, my name is Daniel Lee. I'm a British historian. My first book was on Jews in Nazi-occupied France. I'm a French historian by training, and my first book really looked at what it meant to be young and French and Jewish at the very moment that the Nazis arrived in France. Because, of course, with hindsight, we know that the situation was terrible for France's Jews. But I'm very interested in thinking, what did it mean at the very moment in 1940, 41, 42, when things were a little bit less clear for the Jewish population, many of whom had fathers who'd fought in World War I and grandfathers who'd fought in Franco-Prussia, who really, really felt and believed that they were French above everything else. So that was what my first book was about. I have other interests as well, usually during the Second World War, about the Jews of North Africa. So I've got a big project on at the moment on the Jews of Tunisia, something which a lot of people haven't really thought very much about when it comes to the Second World War. And that, for obvious reasons, historians are very interested in looking at what was going on in mainland continental Europe, especially Eastern Europe. People tend to forget that, for example, the Nazis occupied Tunisia in November 1942. So that's sort of my background in terms of my research interests. I'm British, born in London. I have no connection to France at all. So yes, this and the subject of this new book, again, is something which very much, perhaps we'll talk about in a minute, how I came to this story, but it's something that really fell into my lap as a historian, one of those moments that, you dream of sometimes. So yeah, that was something that I was very excited to write about.
Right, because I was also very excited to read your book, to be honest, because the story tends to draw you in, as I found. It's called the SS Officers Armchair, and it really starts with the story of an armchair and how you came to know about it. Maybe you could tell our listeners about the armchair specifically.
Absolutely. So I had finished my PhD in England, and I moved to Italy. I moved to Italy for a year in 2011 to begin new work in Florence. And a few weeks in, I organized an event at my house in the city centre for new colleagues and friends and whatever. And at that occasion, a young woman came up to me and she said, I'm very interested to talk to you about the Second World War. I understand you're a historian. The most extraordinary thing just happened to my mother. And at that moment, I was thinking, gosh, what do you mean, just? How can something just happen to your mother? Usually when you're talking to a historian of the Second World War, it's something like, oh, this is what happened to my family 65, 70, 80 years ago, whatever. So, immediately I was very interested that something had just happened. Anyway, it turned out that her mum, this Dutch woman, her mum had taken an old armchair that the family had had for decades, since the 1960s, to be reupholstered. And she left it in the store. And a couple of days later, when the reupholsterer had finished doing the work, this woman, the mother, went back to collect the armchair. And upon the arrival, the guy was like, "Excuse me, what is this?" And he was like really cross. And he's like, "I don't do work for Nazis or their family." And she was totally stunned. Like, what are you talking about? And he presented her with a bundle of documents covered in covered in swastikas. And they all belonged to one guy. His photo was on the documents. They were very precious papers. And this woman just looked at the papers, standing in this man's showroom in Amsterdam, thinking, who is this guy? I have absolutely no idea how his documents ended up in my chair. And so that's how this story really begins, with me interested to find out as much as I could about this one man. His name was Dr. Robert Giesinger. He was from Stuttgart, and he was born in 1906. And the documents were extremely precious. They were all personal. They weren't sort of, scraps of, old bus tickets or anything like that. They were his most personal identity papers, the kind of documents anyone would be lost about. And they'd been stitched into this armchair seat for 60 years. And so she basically asked me if I could investigate the story, like who on earth who was this guy, and how on earth his documents ended up inside her armchair. And so that's what really got me hooked.
And what you found was more or less the story and family history of the life of a mid-level to low-level Nazi official. I mean, you discuss in the book, as far as I recall, you discuss his parentage with parents or relatives from America. You discuss his relationship to his mother, which seemed to have been rather difficult. And you even go into like how his family is still split over things that happened in the past until this day. And this is all what I found so fascinating about the book is you describe Griesinger's life, but you also go into your process of researching Giesinger, meeting with members of his family, and going to the archives to discover new details about him.
I mean, yeah. And sorry.
No problem. What I wanted to ask you about is like, what made you choose this unusual approach for an academic historian?
Well, I didn't ever intend for it to be like this. This is something that, as you know, many of your listeners will know, this is something. Sometimes you just get into the research, and then the research you sort of get carried away, and you get very excited by sort of rabbit holes and all kinds of avenues that you hadn't originally thought of. But as we've said, so I'm a professional historian by training, so I went through this in a sense. In a proper, in a proper way, so to speak. So I spoke to the mother of this woman immediately. She told me exactly where she had purchased this armchair, and it was in Prague in the 1960s. She was a student. She needed some cheap furniture, like everybody over the years, to sort of furnish her student accommodation. So she just went to like a thrift store in downtown Old Prague and bought, chair, bed, table, whatever. And then when the family was allowed to leave communist Czechoslovakia in the early 80s, she took a couple of objects with her, one of which was this armchair. So I knew from the start that this story had nothing to do with the Netherlands. It was a story that was to do with Prague and Nazi-occupied Prague. So my first instinct as a historian was to go to the archives. That's what good historians do. We go to the National Archives, and I start because there's nothing, like you say, this guy's a mid to low-ranking Nazi. There is nothing whatsoever about him on the internet, nothing in any books. People like this don't exist. We know everything there is to know about Hitler, Himmler, Goering, etc. But when it comes to people beyond Hitler's cabinet, we know very little about these, low-ranking, ordinary Nazis. So I had to go to Prague. I had to, on the one hand, find out as much as I could about this armchair. I was fascinated by the chair. I wanted to know how much it cost, who its intended buyer was, whatever I could about this armchair. But I also wanted to know everything I could about this one man whose papers were discovered inside. So when I was in Prague doing the official traditional route, that's when I discovered that this guy was in the Nazi SS in Prague, and that he worked in Prague since spring 1943 for the Reich's Ministry of Economics and Labor. That was what his day job was. So he was working every day at this bureau. Essentially, what he was doing was making sure that the Czech economy was working for Germany. And much of this involved sending Czech forced laborers to go and work in Germany. An extremely dangerous conditions. But anyway, I seem to have veered off your question. But to return to it, once I was able to establish he was in the SS, I thought, great, I'm going to go to Berlin and do these other kind of historical, hoovering, for want of a better expression, where we literally just have to go and find out as much as we can from archives which have been totally scattered all over the place. And the SS archives in Berlin was a huge turning point for me, because it was never inevitable. It wasn't inevitable that I would find anything about him. So many individual SS officers' files were destroyed, not least by the Allied bombings of Berlin. So most were destroyed, but I was very fortunate that his remained, and that's what really gave me a key insight into this man, into his background, into his past, into his personality. That's where I found, for example, his family tree, which pointed to his heritage in Louisiana. Like, we always think of Nazis of being, German, and their parents are German and their grandparents are German, etc. Whereas just by looking at this one guy, I was blown away to discover that his father was born in New Orleans in 1871, and that his family had first settled in Louisiana in the 1720s. Extraordinary discoveries. And then eventually, having exhausted as much archival material as I could, the frustration of the silences in the archives, that's when one day I just decided, you know what, I need to talk to somebody that knew this guy. I need to hear his voice more than what I'm hearing from these papers. And so at a total loss, I picked up the phone book, the phone directory to Stuttgart, and I just phoned every single person with his last name, Giesinger, in the phone book, until somebody, everyone just hung up on me. They thought I was crazy. They were like, oh no, sorry, I don't know what you're talking about. But until one guy said, oh yes, that was my father's brother. Do you want to come and see me tomorrow? And so that's how I got into his family. And was able to make contact with him. It was very much not intended from the start. It was something that came after the frustration of the silences of the archives eventually just led me to that. But like you say, it's not a route that everybody would take. And it's something which, I had to think about quite a lot.
So one could say that in part it was inspired by sheer necessity to find out more about this one person, Giesinger, whose documents were in the armchair, and I think it for me, as also a PhD student in history, it was very interesting to read. And I wonder, what are your thoughts? How do approaches like the one you've chosen fit within the scholarly or academic field of the history we deal with? Does it have a place in terms of like academic history, or do you see yourself more working for a popular audience, if you will?
I think you're right to ask this question, because as your listeners will know, this is not the first book on Nazi Germany. Far from it. There are hundreds and thousands of books. This is very much a crowded field, so to speak. So it's always, coming to this as somebody who's worked on the Second World War in France and North Africa, it's always quite scary to dip your toe into the Nazis, because you think, gosh, what on earth can I possibly say? What hasn't been said before? But my goodness, after doing some initial reading, you actually really start to realize that there is so much that we don't know still to be told. And that really explains why there is so much good history that's still being written. So, for example, I read a book while I was doing the research or writing for this, which came out by, I think, a Canadian historian called Amy Carney. And this was a fantastic book, I think, by Toronto University Press, which looked at marriage and fatherhood in the SS, something we don't tend to think about. A lot of what we think about in the SS are these, men in black coats, these psychos who sort of go around shooting communists, shooting Jews, etc. We don't actually think what it meant for these guys to be fathers and husbands and friends and showed people who showed camaraderie or things like that. So that was a wonderful piece of historical writing. But again, it's probably targeted more for an academic audience. The other thing that comes to mind is another fantastic book by Alex Kay, who wrote about an SS killer called Alfred Filbert. But again, this is probably, I think, again, it might be Cambridge University Press. I can't remember. But again, a fantastic book, but perhaps, as I'm suggesting, targeted to a more academic audience. Whereas I hope what I've done in my book, I very much have not had the academic in mind. In fact, usually when we write academic works, we think about our academic supervisors or people we respect in the field sitting on our shoulder, watching us as we type. Whereas, I made sure to dust off my shoulder every time I sat down to write and tried not to think about other academics who might be reading this book. This book is very much intended for people who aren't maybe part of the university world, but who think and have a passion for the history of the Second World War. And hopefully the way I tell the story will be able to make an important contribution to the field, but also be able to make just people out there who are genuinely interested in the war sit up and think, gosh, I've read something new and interesting.
It was my impression that you thread this needle that people in our forum are very familiar with, of writing with writing academically informed for a popular audience, that you thread this needle very well in your book. Because I noticed that in parts you do reference things that, at least in my understanding, are well established within the field of Nazi perpetrator studies. You mentioned the war youth generation, which is a concept that was really expanded upon by Michael Wild in recent years. And you also...
Majestically. You're right. You're absolutely right. It's a fantastic book.
And you also lay out a path, Giesinger's path, in a way that fits very well with a sort of established perpetrator type. It read to me as very classical, coming from a conservative household, missing World War I to do age, then going off to university to become a lawyer, joining a Burschenschaft, becoming more and more right wing, and so I was wondering, how, do you see Giesinger as one of the classical lawyer type perpetrators as they are presented often in the academic literature?
I mean, yes and no, because in some ways you're absolutely right. His trajectory does fit like a glove. It really does. He's born, like you say, between 1900 and 1910, which is a period, as lots of academic historians have already pointed out, is this sort of this people who were born during this period. They're much too young to fight in World War I, but my goodness, does World War I mark their lives? And this is something I think often people outside the universities don't always. Not enough has been written on this area for non-academics. The fact that people who came of age during World War I and then had to see the suffering and the humiliation, the total loss of all the certainties that they had held forever, this collapse. I think that the disorder that followed the First World War, 1918, 1920, this is the period that really marked this generation. And this is something that they were totally, they didn't know it at the time perhaps, but of course not. But it was something that was so formulative for them, such an important moment. And it's really what drove a lot of them forward later in the 1930s and 1940s. So I think, yes, he does fit this generation very, very neatly. But in other ways, he doesn't. I think that some of these people, they do go on to become killers, in a sense that they leave their SS, they sort of work their way up the SS ladder, so to speak. Lots of them end up in Berlin in the 30s, late 30s, and then, they get posted to maybe Vienna or Prague, or in lots of cases, they end up in the killing fields in the East. And this is all through a commitment to the SS, on a desire to be part of this new order. Whereas I think for someone like Giesinger, I don't think that was the case in lots of ways. I think for someone like Giesinger, the fact that he hardly ever got promoted, like so many of these other SS guys, SS lawyers, a lot of that I read as the guy wasn't that, okay, he certainly wasn't an intellectual. He wasn't brilliant. You know, I've been through his school reports, his high school reports, his university reports, and he's very mediocre. But I just find that, like, looking at him in the 20s and 30s, this guy, he likes a comfortable life. He likes being in Stuttgart. He has no desire to sort of climb the ranks of the Nazi party. Let's not forget, the guy doesn't even join the party until 1937. Okay? He doesn't show any interest in Nazism until 1933 when he joins the SS. He is more, his obsession really is, well, as a teenager and guy in his 20s, his obsession is women. But when we get to the 30s, he very much is obsessed with getting a good job in the civil service in the southwest of Germany. That is his priority, to be a lawyer. And he doesn't really dedicate much time to the SS. Like, a lot of people think of the SS that these guys would wear their uniforms every single day to work, whereas somebody like Giesinger would only ever wear his SS uniforms when he had to go to SS meetings, which was maybe once or twice a week in Stuttgart for 2 hours. You know, and they'd sit around and they'd do activities and songs, and they'd have like probably a very racist speech to listen to, and maybe a sporting event, etc. But I think somebody like Giesinger was very much able to ride these two horses at the same time. He was able to dip one toe into SS activities, but at the same time be much more focused on his job as a lawyer and his desire to climb the ranks of the civil service in Württemberg during the 1930s. So I don't always see him as fitting it as precisely as some of these much more notorious SS men who people like Michael Wild and others write about.
That's among the things I've found interesting about Giesinger, because when reading your book, up until the war starts, the biography of Giesinger reads very classical. He works for the Gestapo, he's in the SS. And then for his activity alone, there is this break, because he joins the Wehrmacht. He doesn't join the Einsatzgruppen. He does not become part of the fighting administration, as I think Wild calls them with regards to the SS.
Well, there's no natural segue for him to do that. So many of these guys had spent, 36, 37, 38, 39 in these SS bureaus every single day wearing their uniform, but that just wasn't the case for him.
I think that's a really interesting break, because it impresses upon people that, it's not necessary that these people became or joined this kind of endeavor. Like, he does take part in war crimes, most likely, when fighting in the Soviet Union, but he's not part of the killing squads.
No, he is very much wearing his regular army uniform when he is in the Soviet Union. The guy is not part of these, these murderous, bloodthirsty, if you like, groups that we know, which historians have written so much about. These brilliant works by Christopher Browning and others. He's definitely not part of that, but boy, does he know these guys. Boy, was he friends with them in the 1930s, and still is. Someone like Stahlecker, head of one of the most famous killing squads, the Einsatzgruppen A in the Baltic, in Latvia and Estonia, etc. This is a guy who he had worked with every single day in Stuttgart as a lawyer at the Gestapo, somebody who he knew intimately. Stahlecker even signed off his request to get married in 1936. Like, the guys were extremely close. So he knew these guys. And when eventually he did find himself marching into Ukraine in June, July 1941 as part of the Wehrmacht, we know, I'm not, by far from it, I'm not the first historian to show the proximity that existed between these killers and ordinary soldiers. Like, for years after the war, for decades after the war, people used to think, oh, these Wehrmacht soldiers, what good, heroic, brave men, they were fighting the Red Army, and oh, it was only a handful of, naughty, bad Einsatzgruppen or whatever. They were the killers. There was this sort of entrenched separation. Whereas, I show, and many other historians have also showed, the way in which this separation was not so clear. And that not only were a lot of Wehrmacht officers, soldiers, actually working side by side with these killers, sometimes doing some, shielding them while they carried out the killings. But actually, some of these Wehrmacht officers, some of the ones I have looked at in Giesinger's group, were carrying out murders of Jews themselves, often as reprisals. We see this all over Ukraine, especially in July 1941. Giesinger's group, Giesinger's unit, is marching east towards Kiev, and on the way, his exact unit carries out reprisals against local Jewish people in Rivne and in Lutsk, both of which take place in July 1941. Giesinger is there. It is the army. It is ordinary soldiers like Giesinger carrying out the murder of the local Jewish population. Nothing to do with the Einsatzgruppe.
Which also an interesting point. I read your introduction and I was initially skeptical because you mentioned that officials like Giesinger provide or can provide a bridge between the worlds of the regime's officials that are well known to every reader of such books like Hitler and Himmler and the ordinary German population. And I was initially skeptical because Giesinger comes from a conservative family with money. He gets to join university. He gets to join these right-wing Burschenschaft networks. And so I was thinking, like, how is he a bridge to the ordinary German population? But I think that in terms of joining the Wehrmacht, there also can be this bridge. So in this sense, would you say that Giesinger is an ordinary man in the sense of Browning?
Well, I mean, of course, these guys are none. I think all of these guys are totally normal and in lots of ways, right? Like, none of these guys are born monsters. They're not born killers or anything like that. And that's something which I was so fascinated about when it came to learning more about his biography. So, for example, when I found myself regularly interviewing his family, it took a long time to get, for example, his nephew and niece, who still live in his old house, to trust me and to realize I was a serious historian and not some crazy person who was obsessed with an armchair. They eventually sort of gave me a lot of really interesting documents to look at from the family history, one of which was Giesinger's mother's diary. She had kept a diary every single day from the day Giesinger was born until the day he went to university in 1925. Every day she used to write about it. And these aren't just 2 or 3 lines. These are pages and pages. So it was the most extraordinary bit of luck to be able to come across such a remarkable source, to know exactly the kind of family he came from, to know exactly what was discussed at the dinner table, to know what he was learning at school. This woman wrote down every detail about her son. She was able to talk about political influence that her son was developing in the beginning of the 1920s. So just from, he was a goody two shoes, came from this fantastic background, deeply privileged upper middle class background. And yes, he had inherited ideas on extraordinary ideas, really, when you think about it, from his father and his grandmother, who were born in New Orleans. And his grandmother had grown up in a house with an enslaved person. Her father had owned this man. So he did have these ideas about the differences between race, racial thinking, etc., from the American South, which had been transported back to Germany. But nevertheless, in terms of being ordinary, yes, he was an ordinary German, but in the sense, the guy, how I referred to him is more of an ordinary Nazi, because he does join these organizations. He knows the benefits that come with membership. And when he knows that, for example, I don't know, in beginning of 1941, when it just looked, America was out of the war, Russia was out of the war. It was only Britain. It was only a matter of time until Hitler sort of dominated the world. This is when Giesinger is really trying to get a good position for himself in Hitler's Europe, because he knows which horse he has bet on, and he knows that is the horse in which he's going to cast his lot. He is ambitious, he is determined, and he would probably do anything in order to better his personal and professional life.
I think there's a lot of interesting topics in there. Like, I think that the discussion of the transfer of views on race between the American South and Nazi Germany would be a very topical discussion topic on its own.
Mhm.
But I think that for this podcast, before we get to Giesinger's family, which is a highly interesting subject I found, I wanted to ask you about a sort of methodological or theoretical thing I noticed when reading your book. It's in my impression, there is in recent years a rising criticism of biography as a method, because people will argue, referring to the works of Pierre Bourdieu and others, that biography is always a narrative that gets imbued with meaning ex post and projected backwards, and that's why people sometimes take an approach more focused on generation, meaning a collective biography like Wild,
Yeah.
or take a network approach like Sarah Berger has done with the people of the Operation Reinhardt camps. Is this something that played a role for you when choosing how to write your book and how to engage with Giesinger?
To be honest, I don't think so, because these other historians have done such amazing work, like you say. I feel like, I am standing on the shoulders of giants here. So there has been such fantastic work done on Christopher Brown. I could go on. Like, so many people have looked at groups, generations, etc. And they've done such, remarkable work to advance our understanding. But it just seemed to me from the outset, I was just very frustrated that there was nothing at all on one low-ranking Nazi, nothing, but by a historian. Some people have written about, I discovered my grandfather was a Nazi, and then they will go on and write a very interesting book about it. Fine, that's great. And these are very, very interesting studies. But, there's always that relationship between the grandchild and the grandfather or grandmother or whatever, which is somehow blurs the lines between objectivity. And then, you look at some of these studies, like, for example, the brilliant study by Alex Kay. Again, it's one low-ranking person, but who turns out to be a total killer and who joins Einsatzgruppen or anything. I was just struck that no matter how many books we see every single year being written about the Nazis, there was nothing on someone who was just a low-ranking, ordinary Nazi who was not a killer. And so what I tried to do was think about what it meant for this one guy who could possibly, what would it mean to return texture and agency to him? How would that mean for him, in a way, to stand in for the thousands of other anonymous ordinary Nazis who we know nothing about? And we are probably never going to know anything about these individuals. I think it's probably now we're getting to a point that it is almost too late. Obviously, I'm not saying that his biography or his background was in any way typical of all the others, because of course it wasn't. He, like I said, he has this American background, which we'll talk about shortly perhaps. But there are so many common traits that he does have with so many of these other low-ranking people that people like Wild and others have looked about so beautifully, have investigated so beautifully. What I'm trying to do here is really put back in more of the personal life. And like I say, putting in more of the texture and color into these people, just to show that this regime, of which we know so much, was not in any way something created by these monsters or psychopaths, and that in lots of ways these people were completely ordinary.
I think for me, what I find so interesting, or where the direction where I was going with this question in my mind, was also that you are rather open about some of the problems that you encountered when finding out about Giesinger. I remember you visit his family in Stuttgart, and you encounter his nephew and his niece, who is the keeper of the family lore.
Right.
And they tell you the story about a mother who was rather obsessed with her son. I mean, I think you mentioned at some point in the book, Giesinger's mother built a bust of him, a
Right.
real life bust.
Right. And there's a photo in the book of it. Thank goodness I was able to access these family photo albums, which actually was able to confirm much of what they told me. I thought, oh, what are you talking about? They've made a bust. So I thought, she just, I don't know, stuck a few photos together and, put it up on the wall with some sellotape or something. But my goodness, after the war, she never got over her son's death, which is definitely not a spoiler. I do tell the reader at the very beginning of the book actually what happened to Giesinger, that he did die in 1945 in Prague. So that is in no way going to ruin your experience of reading the book. But his mother never, ever got over the fact that she'd lost her son in Prague in 1945. And her post-war life was completely marked by this loss. So she did go away and commission this enormous bust of her son's head, this big bronze black ornament that would just sort of be in the background of the room. It was a shrine in her living room, and there would be all these candles and photographs of her son next to this bust. And every visit, you couldn't miss it. Every visitor to the house would see this bust, and it would be sort of looming. He had this looming post-war presence even after his death. But no, she was, as I've already suggested, this was a woman not obsessed, but deep, who was committed to her son from the day he was born. And the day he went to university, for example, she wrote about, it was the worst day of her life, and how will she get over this, losing her son? And, she wrote about how she would just sit in his bedroom, his empty bedroom, and cry because she'll never get to tuck him in to bed again. What 19-year-old boy is having his mother, tuck him in to bed? He was, they had this very intense relationship, as you said. Yes.
And so you encounter Giesinger through a trove of his own documents, which are very bland in a way, but then through the lens of a mother who has a very intense relationship with her son, and daughters who know very little about him, really. As you also write about his daughters, who you also met,
right.
they knew very little about him. So you encounter him through the lens of other people, in a sense, and try to get a sense for what his personality was like.
Of course. And it's extremely hard as a historian. But I'm thinking this is perhaps one of the reasons why I'm suggesting that it will be very hard in the future to write a book such as this, because, there is only an amount of time left that we can still be interviewing people with memories of people who were alive and who contributed to Nazi Germany. And a lot of these people, as we know, just don't want to talk. And that's totally normal. Like, why should somebody receive a phone call from a stranger and be like, oh, hello, can I interview you about your father? Like, obviously not. Why? What's in it for them? I think most people would slam the phone down. But I think what is fascinating with this family, like, I was extremely fortunate in the sense that Giesinger had died, as I've said, in 1945, leaving behind a wife and two daughters. And these daughters, they grew up, they came of age in the 1950s. When they started asking questions of their father and his role in the war and what have you, nobody wanted to talk to them. They were shrouded in this post-war silence that we know so much about. Other historians have done a magnificent job of showing what it was like to be growing up in the 1950s in West Germany. And so these girls basically spent their whole lives really wondering, thinking about their father, never having any access to him. I mean, the papers were hidden in an armchair, for goodness sake, so it's not as though they could go and look at his documents. So from that point of view, when I sort of came and approached them and asked if I could meet them, it was very easy for me because I had this extraordinary story of their father's documents hidden in an armchair. Most historians, I don't think other people would have been so forthcoming to talk to me. These daughters, they knew nothing about their father's life, and they wanted information from me just as much as I wanted information from them. And I think this produced this very remarkable relationship between us over the years as I was thinking about and writing this book.
Being an Austrian myself, one tends to run into the peculiarities of remembering the family and the war quite frequently, because it's so widespread and pervasive for almost every one of us, really. So
Today,
I'm
yes.
yeah, today. And so it's like when Harald Welzer wrote Opa war kein Nazi, we're all very familiar with how that works. But
Mm.
in the context of doing work on Giesinger, what sort of challenges and peculiarities did you run into with the memory wall, with Opa war kein Nazi? Would you say that this really had an impact on your work?
Yeah, I would
with
definitely.
with
I find
Giesinger?
that a very persuasive argument. I think I write about that in the book, that on one occasion I was sitting with one of Griesinger's daughters, and then all of a sudden her daughter, so Griesinger's granddaughter, walked in the room. And I was just totally amazed at, on the one hand, how little she knew and just hadn't ever bothered to find out about her grandfather and what he had done in the war, but also by sort of, in a way, even though she didn't know anything about him, she was sort of, well, I'm sure he didn't mean it. She was being extremely forgiving and very generous with her interpretation towards this man who she'd never met and only knew about from her mother, who was a child when he died. So I did find this, extraordinary. I mean, we probably, in Britain, we probably have a similar way of thinking about the war. I'm sure, and our grandparents are probably all, we probably think of everybody as a hero or something like that. So I can understand why grandchildren are so protective of their grandparents' memory. I totally get that. But I don't. It's complicated, isn't it? And I think there is still a lot of work that still needs to be done. And I'm saying that as somebody who thinks about this a lot in terms of France and what it meant to be the grandchild of a collaborator in France. And, there is very little writing out there still. It's still perhaps too soon to even be, for historians to have sort of started thinking about some of these generational issues. I'm not sure if that answers your question, though, Johannes.
It kind of does, actually, because it is exactly one of the difficulties of engaging with the subject, in the sense that you have the sense of family, and yet that there is something that is unaddressed or maybe not really spelled out. I think you even mentioned that in your book in a very almost intimate way, that this also led you to engage more with your own family history. Are you, if you're comfortable, could you address that
Of course. No, I
briefly?
mean, it was, as historians, as professional historians, we're always so much interested in other people's family, aren't we? We're always sort of obsessed with, putting other people's families back together and making sense of theirs. And perhaps it's a way, I don't know what a psychologist would say, perhaps it's a way of avoidance. Perhaps we're just avoiding our own pasts or our own family trees. But so I always knew that my family was somehow connected to the Holocaust. I was born Jewish in London, and my grandparents were born in London, so I never really thought about it that much. There was a couple of photos at home, but if it weren't my grandparents or their parents, it couldn't have been anybody that close who was affected. But as I was doing the research in a couple of ways for this book, I was very surprised at how much my family history hadn't been spoken about, how few questions I'd asked about it. So I became a bit more interested in my family's history, like sort of asking my grandparents, who was this person, who was that person, and really discovering that, for example, my grandfather's uncle was deported to Auschwitz in 1942 and gassed. People, characters, relatives just emerged almost from nowhere who were quite close, actually. So grandparents, aunts, uncles, first cousins. But in terms of Giesinger, one of the most extraordinary coincidences, chilling coincidences, occurred when I was following exactly his route into Ukraine in spring, summer 1941, because I always knew that my grandmother's father had come from Ukraine. And so when I was plotting his route east towards Kiev, you know, I had like a big map of Ukraine. I put it on my table and I sort of put little pins in to see where he was going, what route he was taking. And I had this village, which my great grandfather had come from. I had that sort of marked on the map, and I thought, oh gosh, you know, that's in the middle of nowhere in Ukraine. Ukraine is the biggest country in Europe. There's no way in a million years that Giesinger ever passed through this town, obviously. But then, for some reason, as I'm following his route, rather than him going direct onto Kiev, he takes a sudden sort of detour and ends up going directly through my ancestral shtetl. And I was just totally flabbergasted by this. The fact that he found himself looking at the same sights, smelling the same smells, watching the rain, whatever, just seeing the same people that my family had interacted with for generations and generations. And so, yeah, my great grandfather was very fortunate in that he was able to get out with his parents and come to settle in London. But they left behind a whole world of relatives, friends, memories that weren't so fortunate and were there in spring 1941 when Giesinger entered that small village, Stavica, in Ukraine. And so that was just remarkable, the fact that, you know, thinking about this one Nazi, this one individual who was totally disconnected from me and my life in every sense, had actually led me to thinking about my small family shtetl in Ukraine at that moment, and then trying to find out exactly what happened to these relatives of my great-grandfather who didn't leave for Britain at the beginning of the 20th century.
It's something that within the book really came through for me, at least, that, you know, we are recording this during times when COVID-19 and the coronavirus is still something that is relevant to most of us, in that it limits our everyday life quite severely. And yet we are in the middle of June now, and there's sort of a new normal in a sense. And I think with Giesinger, or the sense I got from the book, is that you are very apt at describing how someone who in some respects is extraordinary, with American parentage and hiding his documents in the chair and being found, but who also is a fairly normal middle-class person, adjusts to what can be called extraordinary times, meaning the Nazis, and then specifically the war and his work in Prague for the Economics Administration Office. Because I never got the sense that he treats this as something special, if you will.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, we know today that we for the first time ever, we know that we're living in extraordinary times. But boy, has it taken a lot for us to realize that. We didn't think of that when the Australian fires were happening 6 months ago, and those were, you know, the whole country was up in flames, and even that didn't wake us up. You know, it's only what's happened in the last few months that's really, really sort of shifted the spotlight just onto how we really are living history today. Goodness me. And I think it's quite remarkable that we can recognize that. But I'm just not sure that someone like, you know, despite what we think of the Third Reich and the Nazis, I don't know if Giesinger did realize he was living in extraordinary times, given, you know, what had happened in World War I and the utter, as I've said, collapse of everything that had happened in 1919-20 for him and people of his background, the humiliation and, you know, this threat of communism, etc., that was just looming large for someone like Giesinger. So, yes, a drastic solution was needed to counter the communist menace for someone like Giesinger, and that's what he found probably in Nazism. But I don't know if he would have found it particularly extraordinary. I don't know if he would have sort of woken up and thought, gosh, we're living in extraordinary times. For him, I think this would have been probably nothing compared to what would happen if communism had somehow been able to take hold in Germany.
And it also goes to show, I think, how or at least it contributes to showing how all this violence that the Nazis enacted on Europe was possible, because at some point for people like Giesinger, it was just a job.
Right. Right. For him, he was working at the Gestapo as a lawyer in the mid-30s. And he would have been, he wouldn't have worn some he wouldn't have been involved in rounding up sort of communists, social democrats, Jews, or anything. His job would have been he would have had an office job. He would have worn his suit. He would have just got on with it. He wouldn't have been involved. He'd have been sort of typing on his typewriter, maybe in an office on a different floor from the torture chambers, which were in the basement of his building in Stuttgart. So yes, there was, for someone like him, there were lots of ways, and yes, he was able to detach himself quite neatly from what was going around him. But obviously, he knew precisely what was going on. He knew that his orders, maybe to round up people and bring them in for questioning, would not end well for people who found themselves being brought into the Gestapo offices in 35, 36, 37. Similarly, the work he was doing in Prague, again, he's in an office and he's probably traveling around the protectorate quite a lot for work, visiting these factories, closing down factories. But still, a lot of, the people he's sending away to do work, forced labor, the Czech population in Germany, he's not meeting these people. He's not watching their faces as they get on the train, or watching them as they're getting bombed by Allied bombs across Germany, working in dangerous conditions in factories. He knows exactly what's going on, and his hands are dirty, but perhaps he's just not actually as involved with his victims, to use that expression, as others are in a more direct and obvious way.
There's a lot of potential I see in engaging with cases like this from like my perspective in a more academic sense, but also in engaging with it in terms of like letting the wider public experience all this through the pages of your book. And I think that unfortunately we're running low on time. But I wanna to ask you about one final point that relates to all of this in a very, very direct way, namely that on Ask Historians we are often encounter questions by lay people about history that show a certain thirst and interest for a relatable perspective of the single individual in history, because we tend to imagine history as things that happen in the past where the individual people have not that much space often in the discussion. So we get a lot of questions sort of like, I'm a young Roman who has a lot of money to burn. What do I do for fun on a Saturday night? Mm-hmm. And it's sort of, it relates to your book because it's also a perspective that you engage with. And I wanted to ask you if you, where you see like, why do you think this is not more frequent within the academic world, and where do you see the real overarching potential for understanding the past with this sort of perspective, if at all?
So I think that a lot of this probably might just come down to something as basic as time and resources, because like I said, this guy, I set out to answer the question, basically, is it possible to trace one of Hitler's nameless and faceless bureaucrats? I wanted to know the history of one small guy of which nothing whatsoever had ever been written. And that doing that kind of work takes a lot of time. You need to be able to go to lots of different archives. You need to have a lot of patience with different archival systems, some of which give you the document straight away, and others tell you to come back in 20 years. So it's deeply time-consuming, this kind of work, tracing one person who really left, from the face of it, left no mark whatsoever on history. But I would say that, there is so much to be gained from this kind of study, just, by looking as I do at this one guy and just by reassembling these little bits of his life, we're able to see the way in which men like Giesinger, they could just, they could switch effortlessly from being these sort of kind, gentle and funny guys with their families and at work, to then sort of just, as I've already alluded to, just they could just display their coldness, their cunning, and their total indifference in other aspects of their life. So I think, this does, as you've already suggested, I think what I'm doing in this book does contribute to a genre that a lot of us are interested in as historians. This first-person way of writing is almost, this quest of discovery, really. And there's lots of other sort of these narrative non-fictions that take a similar approach to mine, which were deeply inspiring for me when it came to writing this kind of book. Just starting off with one small object, this one armchair that people can relate to, and just pulling a few threads and just seeing where you end up. It was a remarkable exercise, and I'm so pleased that I had the opportunity to do it. But I think a lot of academics with lots of other time and familial pressures on their hands might not have been as willing to sort of get lost in some of these rabbit holes as I was. I'm not sure if that's a good thing, though.
So, unfortunately, this brings us to the end of our episode because we're almost out of time. I want to thank you, Daniel Lee, for coming. And I want to say to all our listeners, thank you for listening. And you should go and buy Daniel Lee's book, The SS Officers Armchair, which is out now and should be available in English at a bookseller near you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Johannes. Thank you very much for having me. It's been a really fun talking to you about it.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. Please support us at patreon.com/askhistorians. Find more history like this by following us on Twitter and Facebook, and by visiting us at askhistorians.reddit.com and ask hundreds of historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know about history.